No matter how long you've actually been playing Yu-Gi-Oh, it sometimes is pretty difficult to actually accurately evaluate how good or how bad a new card is. Obviously, there are extreme cases where you can look at a card and know that it's instantly going to be good, like Sky Striker and Gauge, and of course there's also cards you can look at and say you know they're going to be bad, like many of the pack filler cards that we've come to kind of known as the throwaway cards from any set. However, one pack, or one deck I should say, that a lot of people did not know how to evaluate correctly was the Lair of Darkness structure deck. And I'm not saying that the entire structure deck itself was actually terrible. I'm more so talking about the field spell called Lair of Darkness. And that's an important distinction to make because some of the cards in the structure deck, some of the exclusive cards actually did see some regional success, even if it wasn't going to be the first place deck profile, even if it wasn't going to top a YCS on a consistent basis. Some of these cards did see some play. So for example, Lilith, Lady of Lament, saw some play in a variety of Paleozoic deck profiles, as well as a couple of Altergeist deck profiles. I think one of the coolest things that I saw a person doing with this card is that they would use it to reveal 1 Waking the Dragon and 2 Torrential Tribute, and then your opponent would randomly pick one, which meant that your opponent didn't know if your back row card was going to be Waking the Dragon, in which case they wouldn't want to destroy it, or if it was going to be a card like Torrential Tribute, in which case they would want to destroy it. I think that was sort of an interesting mind game to play on their opponents. And also the boss monster of the Lair of Darkness structure deck, Darkest Diablos, that card actually is still seeing play in a variety of pure Sky Striker decks. Maybe it's not being played in the way that Konami intended. Many of the effects just are completely ignored, but in the Sky Striker strategy, it is a recurring 3000 attack monster that can't be targeted. It makes it really hard to out in the mirror match. Outside of cards like Borolo Dragon, it's just really hard to deal with. But outside of those 2 cards, many of the exclusive cards in the Lair of Darkness structure deck have not seen competitive success, especially the field spell, which only saw play in a couple Infernoid lists early on when the structure deck was released, but at this point has pretty much completely fallen out of the competitive metagame. To fully understand why Lair of Darkness did not see a ton of competitive success, let's take a look at the card itself. So the first effect on this card, and pretty much what all of the effects I guess are based on, is that all face-up monsters on the field become dark. Now why does that matter? Well, it matters because once per turn, if you would tribute a monster you control to activate a card effect, you can tribute 1 dark monster your opponent controls even though you do not control it. In other words, every single turn, once per turn, Lair of Darkness is basically a Monarch Stormforth, but even better because it works with a ton of effects, not just tribute summons, which means that you can use effects like the Infernoid monsters to tribute monsters your opponent controls and then get their effects. That's obviously insane on paper, maybe not so consistent in practice though, which we'll talk about in a second. The other effect on this thing is that once per turn during the end phase, special summon as many Torment tokens as possible to the turn player's field in defense position, up to the number of monsters tributed this turn while this card was face up. Now one thing that's interesting about this card, if you've played it on Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro, you might know that that last effect is mandatory even if monsters weren't tributed. Now that matters because it means that in the unlikely case that Lair of Darkness ever became super competitive, this card actually triggers every single end phase even if nothing was triggered, which means you could attempt to actually just Ghost Ogre it every single end phase if you actually really wanted to kill this card without using something like Cosmic Cyclone, Twin Twisters, or MST. That doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things because this card did not see that much competitive play. However, in the case that it did actually become super competitive, it's just worth noting that Ghost Ogre is an excellent counter to Lair of Darkness. Like I just mentioned, one of the best combos to actually do with Lair of Darkness is summon Infernoid monsters, but obviously some of the monsters that I talked about a little bit ago, like Lilith and like Darkest Diablos, were clearly designed to work with Lair of Darkness in mind. Obviously they're in the same structure deck, which means that Konami wants you to play them in the same strategy. However, one of the issues with this strategy is that many of the cards, including Lilith and including Darkest Diablos outside of Sky Striker decks, is that those cards are not very good unless you have Lair of Darkness out, and Lair of Darkness is not very good unless you have those specific cards in the specific scenarios that you want them to have. And that's not good deck building. Many of the top decks are good without their other combo pieces and just become even stronger when you assemble the right cards together. If you think of the Sky Striker Trickstar list, it's not that the Trickstar cards are bad by themselves, and it's not that the Sky Striker cards are bad by themselves, but they're just good independent engines, and then when they're combined, they make an even better sort of field, even better disruption, all that sort of good stuff. However, in any Lair of Darkness variant, pretty much outside of Infernoids, every single time you have Lair of Darkness without the appropriate monsters to combo with it, it's just a blank card, and this is amplified by the fact that in a deck with Lair of Darkness, you likely want to play multiple copies. Now, I'm not going to ignore the fact that this card is wildly searchable with cards like Terraforming and even the level 4 monster that came from that structure deck, but even with those things considered, you're now just adding copies of a potential dead draw. You really do not want to see a hand with more than one copy of Lair of Darkness, but you want to see Lair of Darkness in every single hand, which creates this interesting conundrum where you want to find the right amount of this card to play without seeing too many copies of it, and I don't think there actually is a correct answer to that. If you've been trying out a lot of deck lists, you might find if you just play a couple copies of Lair of Darkness, you don't see it often enough, but if you play too many copies, you're seeing it way too often, which really screws you up. And then many of the cards outside of the Infernoid monsters, which aren't really that good right now, but just for the sake of argument, we'll say that Infernoid monsters are just generally good. Outside the Infernoid monsters, many of the cards that you want to combo with Lair of Darkness are just not very impactful unless you have Lair of Darkness on the field. I think of Lilith, which isn't a terrible card, but if you think of that card without the implication of having Lair of Darkness, it's not that great. It's not even a +1 or anything. It's just a 1-for-1 to search a normal trap card, but it's not even a guaranteed search, and your opponent gets to see what you grab. Well, I guess they don't get to see which specific card you grab, but they get to see which cards you reveal. So outside of that Waking the Dragon scenario that I talked about a little bit ago, the card just isn't that consistent, and it doesn't make enough of an impact unless you're comboing it with Lair of Darkness to actually tribute your opponent's cards. Now, I will admit that I'm one of the people that thought this card was going to be really impactful. I even built a Paleozoic Lair of Darkness strategy that really cemented itself in my mind as a good rogue option, maybe even better than the normal Paleozoic Frog list. Now, that deck was, the main combo in it is that you were activating Lair of Darkness, summoning Lilith, and then tributing your opponent's monster to set a Paleozoic monster, and I thought that was pretty good. I honestly believe that was a pretty good rogue strategy. However, on like the first live stream that I played, the first couple games, I just bricked every single time. There were games where I drew Lair of Darkness and no Lilith. There were games where I drew Lilith and no Lair of Darkness, and no amount of tinkering with the ratios and strategy actually helped it to become good. And I think it's on that live stream, that very first live stream, that I realized, hey, maybe these cards aren't all they were hyped up to be. And even in the case of the decks that have played these cards, they're never the standard build. Sky Strikers don't play Darkest Diablos as a standard option. It's just a card that some people play and has seen some success, and Lilith isn't a really popular card in the decks I talked about earlier. Even though some people top to regional teching it, it's not a standard option, and even in Infernoid lists, if those really even exist, Lair of Darkness was never the most successful variant in the history of Infernoid decks. Obviously, that Grasslook Screener is a much better card for the deck, and I know that card is banned right now, so it's not the best comparison, but Lair of Darkness did not revitalize the strategy like a lot of people assumed it would. At the end of the day, though, I'm not saying Lair of Darkness is a bad card. I'm just saying it has inherent flaws, and I think this is a really interesting contrast to the video that I did a couple weeks ago talking about that Eater of Millions shouldn't be a good card, but actually is a good card. Lair of Darkness is pretty much the exact opposite, because when this card was revealed and when the entire structure deck revealed, a ton of pro players really did think that this was going to be the next big thing. Think it was way too unfair, because it definitely sounds unfair using your effects that have costs and distributing your opponent's monsters as a cost and still getting a benefit. That sounds unfair on paper, but it turned out in practice it just wasn't consistent enough to actually make an impact. Maybe if we get more cards that boost this strategy, we'll see Lair of Darkness as a competitively viable deck. However, in its current form, I just do not see that happening. Lair of Darkness is a cool card, and it's It's a card that Konami really hasn't made before. There aren't really any comparisons to make to a card like this, where you can sort of avoid your costs by attributing your opponent's cards as costs, and it is pretty interesting in the case of it being a field spell compared to a one-time effect like the Monarch Stormforth. However, the card just did not see a lot of play, and I wanted to make a video just kind of talking about the history of the card and why it didn't actually make a big difference. Anyway though, let me know what you guys think about Lair of Darkness and what Konami could have done to make it better. Is there even a way to make this card better? Is it even good to make this card better? I think we look at cards a lot of the times and say every card would be cool if it was viable. However, I ask myself, do we really want to play in a format where Lair of Darkness and a Lair of Darkness strategy is the best deck? I mean, when Monarch Stormforth was at 3 copies per deck and a lot of people were playing it in their just rogue strategies, it was completely fine because people don't run it into it very often. However, when Monarchs as a deck became really good and everyone was playing Stormforth, it was one of the most annoying cards in all of existence to actually play around, so much so that I actually put it on a different video's top 5 list. Anyway though, that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys later.